So I see the thumbs up. We can start. So welcome. Today I have the honor to give you a speed run on data-driven impact analysis when it comes to Web3, especially in governance and impact funding. I think one of the most exciting spaces that we as a community can have, especially considering that it's the year of the regenerates, but also considering that we as a Web3 community have a unique opportunity because we have so much data on chain to leverage that to make better decisions and show to the case to the world that this is a really, really good system and we want to make it right. I'm honored today to be joined with two amazing panelists. You will hear a lot about them in just a couple minutes. We're going to introduce Devansh and NaMu, who are both pioneers and legends in that space. And I want to give it to Devansh first to introduce yourself quickly.
So, hey guys, my name is Devansh and I work in the Ethereum Foundation, leading their AI and public goods track. So I've been looking mostly into how we can create like AI and ML competitions and how we can use that to make the space of funding capital and like identifying Sybil and other things more accessible to machine learning model builders.
Perfect. Hi everyone, my name is NaMu. I'm the founder of Metrics Garden Labs. We are an impact studio and we focus on several different things. One of those is consulting. We've worked with Optimism, with the Ethereum Foundation, and with some of the other ecosystems in mapping out what impact looks like in their ecosystem so that they can appropriately fund the work that is being generated and contributing to their growth.
Let's jump straight in. So public goods funding in the Ethereum ecosystem, one of the most important things that we can talk about because much of our software, dApps built on top of repositories that are open source and also the community that organizes events. How is it currently funded now and what do you see are the benefits, also challenges of how the system is currently doing it?
Yeah, so I think as we've seen across ecosystems, one of the things that's being funded the most is infrastructure. The reason for it is because it's one of the easiest contributions to attribute to the owners of the work and to clearly map out how they are linked to each of the particular ecosystems, which makes it a lot easier to quantify how much funding they should be receiving. But at the same time, it leaves for such a big room for improvement in terms of funding all of the other different needs that an ecosystem has in order to grow and in order to continue to attract new use cases, new builders into them. And so what we've seen here, I'd say particularly this year, in 2023 there was an attempt to fund more categories across public goods. But this year in particular, we've seen a very, very narrow scope of what's being funded. And again, focusing on infrastructure and ensuring that the technology layer of the different ecosystems is well served. But it does leave a lot of room for improvement for several of the other activities and contributions such as education, community contributions towards user onboarding, and the development of localized use cases to emerge. So I'd say that's one of the largest opportunities. One of the reasons that we see this gap is the gap of data to measure these contributions, what is the impact that they've had for each of the ecosystems, and therefore being able to correctly attribute how much funding they should be receiving.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great follow-on about how we can expand the number of categories. And I think one of the most promising projects to emerge this year is Kaito AI, Kaito AI. And basically what they do is they have the industrial grade Twitter API and they get all of the tweets for a project. So who is the number one yapper for Arbitrum? And they create a leaderboard and that actually allows ecosystems to also fund not just infrastructure, but also fund like marketing and actually get to know who is doing the most marketing. So I think like one of the most exciting things is how we can expand from just infrastructure, which is easily measurable, to even other categories like marketing and other sectors that are equally important for an ecosystem to grow.
I think that puts us straight into the question of impact, which I think is at the center of funding. Impact is such a fuzzy term. Could you help me explain a little bit, just make sense of it, what does impact mean and why should we fund it?
Mm-hmm. So impact, and I think this is a really good question because one of the big misconceptions in the space has been identifying impact as the outputs. So a lot of the projects and a lot of the ecosystems have been focusing on like, did you complete your deliverables, and identifying these specific outputs that projects had committed to deliver as the impact that they've been generating in the ecosystem, which if we're thinking of a theory of change, which is a really good framework to think about what is the impact that we want to have, that wouldn't fit within what impact actually is. So impact should be the outcomes of the actions that a project has had, or the work that they've been doing, which is very different from the output. So output, and I think the reason why some of the projects have hyper-focused on the outputs is because those are really tangible and really easy to identify if the people that have requested a grant or the projects that have requested a grant have actually completed these deliverables. But one of the big misconceptions is confusing outputs for impact, where impact is actually the long tail of what comes after the actions have happened. And this is something that takes time to be observed. And in our industry, which doesn't really take time to consider what's happened and look back at what the results have been of what has been funded, is something that is usually a big problem.
Yep, so just building on that quickly, I think like outputs are what you deliver, and outcome is the effect of of your output. So if your output is a journalism article, and then the outcome might be if that article gets cited in some lawsuit, or like it gets cited by a congressman or something like that. So that's the output and outcome. And impact I define, which is kind of unique definition, is outcome relative to cost. So I mean, educating a child is great, it's an outcome. But if you do so at $1 million, it's a negative impact because you spend so much to do it for a single child. So I think accounting for the intuition that cost has to be baked into impact is another important aspect.
Yeah, and I think like one of the pieces that has not even been explored in the space, which I understand, it's also because it's challenging and we can't even get to impact evaluation in terms of a positive sense. Like we are not there yet, but one of the items that's still greatly unexplored is negative impact, right? Like how do we take into account when some of the outcomes from the different outputs that players are generating in the ecosystems is actually impacting the ecosystem in a negative way, and how that should be handled, and whether that should be penalized or considered in a different way.
Wonderful. I think in many ways impact is the action you've done minus if you wouldn't have done this action, which is considered a counterfactual. So counterfactuals are really important in measuring impact, and you both have been involved in a project called Counterfactually. Could you talk a little bit about this as well?
I mean, you're the expert on counterfactual analysis and how it works. Maybe I'll do a story and then you can kind of talk about it in the concept-wise. So the story which David himself told me was that the carbon credits market historically used to use historical baselines. So the rate of deforestation was maybe like 5%, and then it reduced to 3% over the next 2 years. So you mint a carbon credit for that 2% decrease. But this is obviously a flawed methodology because the entire world deforestation rates might be decreasing. So that's where the idea of counterfactual analysis came in, where these economists went and calculated that you have to look at the neighboring areas where an intervention was not staged, and then minus the deforestation rate from your area minus the neighboring area where you are not active. And then they actually found that the value of like a lot of these carbon credits was worthless, and it led to like this massive scandal, and the Vera CEO had to resign, and it was like really fun thing to stick it to the man. So I think we aren't seeing this analysis happen in the blockchain world so much. It's like, hey, I did this app and it's got so many transactions. But this idea that if you didn't exist, what would have happened and which other app would have got those transactions, I think that's a kind of a black hole that no one is really addressing.
Yeah, and I think pulling it into into operation in the Web3 space, one of the reasons why counterfactuals are really interesting is we have a limited amount of funds that we're directing towards public goods. So we want to identify how can we use these resources in the most efficient way to get the most out of this funding. And through that, one of the things that we need to do is identify which are the teams that are having the most impact towards the specific goals that we're trying to achieve in a particular ecosystem. So by using counterfactuals, we can look at which projects were not funded that are very similar to other projects that were actually funded, and what does this intervention, which is the action of funding the projects, what type of effect did it have on the growth of the project, and then on the impact that they were able to deliver for the ecosystem.
So we ran a counterfactual analysis on on-chain data on Arbitrum, and that gave some really interesting insights. Devansh, you used to be a delegate in Arbitrum. Could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so like Arbitrum had run a massive program called the Short-Term Incentives Program, which was meant to boost the growth of protocols on Arbitrum. So if you use any protocol, they'll give you like money for using it. So the protocols have to pass on the money to the users. And it was something around 70 or 80 million dollars that was allocated for this purpose. But after David and all of us ran the analysis using counterfactual analysis, and basically what we did was we found a synthetic control. And the idea of a synthetic control is which chain is most similar to Arbitrum before a particular time period. So in our analysis, we found that Arbitrum was 0.6 optimism, 0.3 Ethereum, and 0.1 Polygon. So because Polygon and Optimism did not run the short-term incentives program, we look at the graph of how they grew, and we look at the graph of how Arbitrum grew after the program came into effect, and we found like a negligible impact of this incentive program on the growth of Arbitrum. It grew at almost the same rate as the synthetic control. So that's kind of in a brief how that case study looked when we actually applied this analysis to Web3 protocols.
Awesome. So looking into, there's a famous saying in our space that says you cannot value what you cannot measure, right? And in many ways, Lau, you have been developing this really wonderful framework for impact, for optimism, retro PGF, but many of these metrics might not be measurable. Should we not care about them?
No, we should. But I think what it actually gives us is a good opportunity to identify what are the data sets that we can use to develop proxies for these particular metrics. So I think there's a lot of nuance that we can explore when we're thinking of the data that's used and the metrics that we're using to understand what impact means within each one of the ecosystems. And one of the things that's still to be explored is what are some proxies that we could use from existing data sets that can correlate well with the impact that has been generated by some of these projects. I definitely don't think that it's something that just because we can't quantify it in the same way in which code contributions can be quantified, which are still very flawed. Like if we look at the first type of metrics that we were leveraging at the end of last year, at the end of 2023, beginning of and even throughout 2024, when we were looking at how many stars does a project have, how many forks does a project have, which doesn't really tell you much about how much value that project is being generated. The fork might be empty, maybe no one is building on top of that fork. So there's still a lot of nuance to look into. How can we find proxies for some of these contributions that are more fuzzy than code? And then how can we either generate new data sets or pull from different members in the community that are more in tune with the type of data that these projects are generating so that we can leverage this information?
Yeah, just building on that, I think one approach is proxy data. I think it still might fall prey to Goodhart's law. So Goodhart's law basically says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So I mean, like, what are the ways out of Goodhart's law? And I'll say one, and then you can respond. Is the idea of like non-deterministic models. So something like the Arbitrum delegate incentives program has, it's a very deterministic model that if you have these many comments on the forum, if you have these many votes, you're going to get paid this much money. And it's actually resulted in a lot of low quality comments because people are trying to game it and like it's falling prey to Goodhart's law. So one of the initiatives that we are working on at the Ethereum Foundation is using a non-deterministic model. So that's basically what an AI or an LLM is, where they predict how much money a project should get. And we use a jury to serve as ground truth data. And the ground truth data is used to see which LLM model is most closely aligning with the human preferences. So that's one way out of Goodhart's law, but I'm curious to know what other ways.
Yeah, so another way is to design the metrics. I think right now what we've been exploring is just metrics that already exist, that metrics that are already out there, and we're not really looking at complex metrics, which then enable you to choose what are the type of metrics that even if they are gamed, they are actually generating a net positive value for your ecosystem. So you can even sort of like play the game with those that are trying to extract from your system and identify what are the type of metrics that I can include in this design so that even if someone is trying to game them, it's aligned with the outcome that I want to see for my ecosystem, and the gains that they are having are still under the value that they've generated for my ecosystem. But I think we're still in very early stages in terms of identifying what are existing metrics, and we haven't taken a step towards how can we build more complex metrics.
I want to use the last 10 minutes to first ask you about deep funding and then throw in a spicy question in the end. But so you mentioned already a little bit about the AI agents, what the Ethereum Foundation has done. Is it true that Vitalik himself came up with this mechanism? Why do you think he cares so much about this? And can you talk a little bit more about deep funding?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with a story. I'm a journalist, so we like stories. After DevCon, I just made a tweet saying that these are the things I'm interested in working on in 2025. And one of them was using AI to quantify impact. And then Vitalik just saw the tweet and he messaged me and said, hey, I've been thinking about something similar. And he laid out this very sophisticated mechanism that he's clearly been thinking about for years. And that eventually became deep funding. And the broad idea is a dependency graph. So Ethereum is underpinned by around 5,000 open source repos. And each of these repos is used multiple times. So when we create the dependency graph of Ethereum, there are 15,000 edges in that graph. And basically Vitalik is interested in trying to give a weight to these lines in the graph, because then he can put money into one public key and it gets sent to all of the repos based on how much value they've provided. So obviously the question then becomes, how do we decide the weights that should be assigned to these repos and the lines? And that's where Vitalik felt that AI can be used, that we have a competition where anyone, even any of you are model builders or know AI here, just like submit your predictions of how important these different edges are. There are around 15,000 of them. And kind of as a juror, Vitalik said that when someone asks me to rate something, I lose attention and then I end up giving random numbers and I don't like that, so then I have to take a break. So he's saying, how do we make it that I only have to give a few judgments and then those few judgments go into selecting all of the projects? And that's what deep funding is, that a judge gives a few judgments, those few judgments go into selecting the winning AI model, and the winning AI model gives weights to all of the kind of repos that are there in that. So that's kind of the quick overview of it.
You can learn more about deep funding with deepfunding.org. It's super interesting. One of the definitely more interesting experiments that is happening right now in the space. So, Devansh and Lau, you both are caring a lot about impact measurement, and you both care about that this space of public goods gets funded. From a journalism side, from a design and principle perspective, but you both also approach this in a very different way, right? While Devansh, as far as I understood and also observe you, you're moving in this space in incredible speed. You're trying out things, you're breaking things, you're trying out again, and you're seeing what comes out. While Lau, you're more the conscious designer. You're sitting there, sometimes thinking very long on how to get these metrics right, not even thinking if there's data on that or not. Who of you is right?
That's a very good question. I think both approaches have their benefits to it, one of the reasons why I tend to be more reluctant in terms of moving really fast is because of the long-term impact that this actually has on the communities and the different projects that are contributing to ecosystem growth. For example, one of my main pushbacks when Optimism shifted to slash several of the categories that they were funding in Richer PGF starting 2024 was because this ecosystem had already created this positive flywheel in terms of signaling that if certain type of work is getting done, we'll find a way to reward it, which means that you're already creating expectations in different types of contributors for what type of work you want to see, and identifying that and not only identifying but committing to fund that type of work. And if suddenly you breach the trust that you had developed with these particular groups, it becomes a lot more difficult to get them back into your ecosystem. And this is something that is easily observed in how humans are very reluctant to change their patterns, not only in terms of technology, but if we want to look at an example of technology is most companies need to ensure that when they are pushing out a product, it has to be this minimum lovable experience. Like you need to like the experience that you're having with that product, because if it doesn't work, the deflection rate is so high and the cost of trying to get those users back into your product is twice as expensive or even more than acquiring a new user. So if we're creating these terrible funding experiences for contributors because they don't fit into one of the particular categories, to me, and this is why I care about it so much, and I try to move a little bit slower and thinking more about what is the long-term effect that this is going to have in the ecosystem, is it means that we're pushing people away that we don't know if we're going to be able to get them back.
Right. So this reminds me of my favorite quote from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who said that concepts without percepts are empty, while percepts without concepts are blind. And kind of what that means, like a concept is a unit of an idea, and a percept is a unit of experience. So if you have ideas but no physical instantiation of it, that's an empty set. It's just an idea without an actual physical manifestation. And if you just have experiments but without concepts, then it's blind. So ideally you want both the concepts and the conceptual thinking, and you want like moving fast and breaking things as well. And ideally both of them go well hand in hand together. So that's kind of, I think, overall what I feel. But I feel like the idea stage has to convert to pilots. And something I'm excited about in Optimism is their Futarchy experiment, where they have given, like you can sign up for it today. Like you can go and get play money from Optimism, and you can bet which protocol is going to generate the most TVL. Because TVL is one of those metrics which you just want, like it's okay if you're gaming it, we still want you to lock your assets on our chain. And like you have to bet which protocol is going to do the most TVL in the next 6 months. And if you're right, then you basically get real money from your play money. So I think that's kind of one of the cool experiments of converting the concepts of having ungameable metrics into actual physical pilots that you have.
Which I think, again, it comes again with this nuance of the design. Because, for example, for this particular pilot, something that we're going to test is if people actually care, because this is play money, right? So it doesn't really follow even the theory of Futarchy, in which you're incentivized to do this extra work because you're getting a monetary reward that justifies putting time into this thing. But if we're doing it with play money, so we actually don't know what's the actual benefit that I'm getting from investing X amount of time into producing and like really trying to assess which of these protocols has the best odds, like how have they performed previously. Like this is a lot of work that if I don't know what is the type of reward that I'm going to getting, why am I going to be wasting my time to do this? Which I think is part of the thinking through the design of these experiments really well, so that we understand if it's actually going to lead to the outcomes that we want to see. We're still going to gather data, but I think another really important piece to keep in mind when we're experimenting is if this data is clean and useful. Because if we're just producing data for the sake of producing data, and this is trashy data, like there's this concept as well in data science that trash comes in into your model, trash comes out. If your data is bad, the outcomes are going to be bad.
I can definitely feel some heat, which is pretty good in Denver. You know, it's sometimes too cold, you know, you want to be at a place where it's hot. So in the last 3 minutes that we have, just quickly, because you both have been so influential in that space, how would someone who just gets started in public goods funding, impact measurement, in Web3, how would you recommend them to go through?
I think I've actually written a lot of SOPs here. In 2023, I was selected as the Ethereum Next Billion Fellow, so I actually had to figure out how we talk to people who want to enter the space and what actions to give them. So if I have to give you points, number 1, you should get an ENS. An ENS is an identifiable name to your wallet and to your public key. Number 2, you should lock some GLM into Octant. Octant is a staking protocol where they have 100,000 ETH and they distribute around 300 ETH every 3 months. So it's a lot of money that they're giving. And you get a right to say which project should actually get that money. So you should do that and you should tweet about it. You know, hey, I've voted in Octant and these are the projects I supported. The third is Gitcoin and Giveth rounds. So make sure that you actually vote in the Gitcoin and Giveth rounds because your supporting projects in those rounds results in money to them from the matching pool. So that happens every 3 months around. So that's Gitcoin, Giveth, and the last is taking part in DAO governance. Basically lock up the token of a DAO that you're interested in and start voting on their proposals. And in all of this, you have to be tweeting. Like that's like the number 1 rule. That's how I got to be working with the EF and on deep funding and all of that. So just like whatever you're doing, just tweet it out so that other people can learn and build on it.
Yeah. So I think it really depends on why you are interested in getting into public goods. Because the pathways are very different. If you're a project and the reason why you're getting into public goods is because you want to get funded, if you want to work on designing public goods, or if you want to leverage the mechanisms offered by public goods to distribute funding. So if you want to if you're a project looking for funding through public goods, I think participating in the Octant rounds is really good. Participating in Gitcoin is also pretty good. There's Giveth as well, recently ran one of the largest, I think it's QF rounds, specifically around public goods. So there's multiple projects building for the distribution of funding for public goods. So definitely check out Gitcoin, Octant, Giveth. Then if you're interested in coming in as a designer of public goods and stewarding where precisely these the thoughts of and the type of experiments that are being carried out in public goods are, then definitely join a DAO. Identify one, that it's a DAO that funds public goods. I would suggest like Optimism. Octant is also really good. Like they're bringing in a lot of new people that contribute to how the rounds, how the epochs are being designed. Then get involved as well with Gitcoin. And if you are, what was it?
And nouns?
Nouns. Nouns is also really, really good for that. But yeah, I'd say those are the...
Wonderful. I think we all have like a really long list of homework to do now in case you guys want to join this. I think this was a really wonderful, comprehensive list. And so thank you so much for your time, Lau, Devansh, and a big applause for our panelists.
And you were a really good moderator. I wish that we heard more from you as well. Yeah.